Okay, we're ready to go. Thanks for your patience and thanks for coming. Just a brief announcement from another organization of which I'm a member. First of all, my name is Julie Gordon, and I'm a member of Move to Amend here in Rochester. I'm also a member of a wonderful Minnesota organization called Land Stewardship Project. For those of you that know Alita, who's sitting right there. Oh, lots of people, okay. So if I make a misstatement, somebody please stand up and correct me. But I'm just going to give a brief little synopsis of land stewardship and then a call to action for something I'd like your help with, if you're willing. Land Stewardship Project is a private, nonprofit organization founded in 1982 to foster an ethic of stewardship for the land, to promote sustainable agriculture, and to develop sustainable communities. At the core of all our work are the values of stewardship, justice, and democracy. And I think you'll see how LSP's values as an organization fit nicely with the work that Move to Amend does. One last thing before I do my call to action. The Land Stewardship Project wants more farmers stewarding the land. We want strong, vibrant, healthy communities, and we want a democracy where directly affected people have a say over decisions that impact our lives. We believe we're each stronger when we all have the chance to prosper, and that well-being of people and the land are connected. But one way we see this vision being blocked, these values isolated, is in the excessive power and control of major corporations have over our economy and our democracy. There is no clearer example of this than our healthcare system. So tonight I'm here to ask for your help in responding to a call for action from Land Stewardship. And what we are calling for action on is, I have lots of pieces of paper. We're asking you to sign and share a petition, which I'm going to be passing around. The petition will be presented to our new governor on November 13th. Several of us from Land Stewardship will be going up to the cities to present the petitions to him. Our call for action is asking for a moratorium on the closing of rural hospitals and clinics. We're asking that the governor establish a people-centered rural health care access task force. And we are asking that the governor make Minnesota Care available as an option for all Minnesotans so that everyone can have a health care plan available to them that provides meaningful care. So that is our call for action. I'm going to be sending around some petitions. I would ask that you sign if you feel so moved, and you can just leave them or return them to me at the end of the night. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me or Alita. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Marie Davidiak. Right? Come on up.
Good evening. We're delighted that you've come here to learn more about the Move to Amend movement. We had originally scheduled Caitlin Saposi Belknap, the National Director of Move to Amend, but due to a personal situation with a dear pet of hers, she could not come tonight. We are very proud to welcome Keyan Bliss as Amend's Grassroots Volunteer Coordinator. He serves on the Media and Communications, Grassroots Movement, and Political Organizing Committees. He started in 2013 as an intern with the National Leadership Team. He was the executive producer of Move to Amend's online radio program, Move to Amend's Reports, and currently produces their monthly live streaming program and Move to Amend Live Report. He sees the goal of ending corporate constitutional rights and money as protected speech to be a crucial first step towards real change in U.S. society. He eventually hopes to expand constitutional reform to include a new Bill of Rights to expand the protection of civil liberties to all human beings without distinction. Please welcome Keyan.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, First Unitarian, for hosting us as well. As you know, my name is Keyan Bliss. I'm the Grassroots Volunteer Coordinator of the National Move to Men Coalition. And I moved, like many of you, I've actually been born and raised here in the Midwest. I was originally born in Ohio and raised in Indiana, and I currently live out in Sacramento, California, where the national headquarters is located. But today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about our national coalition Move to Amend, which launched back in January 21st, 2010. And for those of you who are familiar with that date, that was the same day that the Supreme Court handed down its disastrous decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. And before I go into what we're doing and why we're doing it, I just want to tell you a little story of how we arrived at the present situation that we're here in 2018. So most if not all of you are aware, the Citizens United decision opened the floodgates for an unlimited amount of money coming from nonprofits and corporate funders and super PACs to influence our electoral process and basically buy off our candidates. There have been many organizations that have risen to overturn the Citizens United decision in the past 8 years, but most of those organizations focus exclusively on just getting money out of politics, for good reason. But the root of the problem goes much, much deeper than just the amount of money in politics. And it goes much further back than just 2010, when we can even tell that even from the recent history. If you can go ahead, I'm sorry. Oops, one moment. Backtrack a little bit just to the agenda so you all know what I'm going to be going through tonight. So we're going to go over an overview of Move to Amend and really kind of frame out the big picture of why we're doing what we're doing, and also talk about the power dynamic of the Constitution versus the people. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about the current situation that has been presented, not just with Citizens United, but other Supreme Court decisions that have opened the door for corporate power to basically assert itself over the rights and basic interests of we the people. And then we'll also get into a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. So with that said, we can move on. So yeah, like I said, Move to Amend is a national nonpartisan coalition of over 450,000 people, an organization, and over 500 organizations of individuals committed to social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that is genuinely accountable to the people and not just corporate interests. And to do that, our goal is to pass the 28th Amendment to the Constitution, known as the We the People Amendment, which makes clear that artificial entities incorporated by state law, that includes corporations, that includes unions, nonprofits, and other limited liability companies, don't have the same rights, same inalienable rights as human beings. And also to make clear that money is not free speech, is not equal to free speech, so that it can actually be regulated in our electoral process. And we're seeking to do this within the same amendment, within a single amendment, so that it leaves for no loopholes for corporate power to reassert itself. One of our primary goals is to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make the promise of democracy through a constitutional renewal, which starts with the 28th Amendment. And as I was saying before, while many organizations have risen to overturn Citizens United, like Move to Amend, their focus tends to be exclusively on just the money and politics aspect, for good reason, but the root problem goes, as I said before, much, much deeper than just the money in politics, and it goes much further back than just 2010 Citizens United decision. We can even tell that from recent history. Go ahead. So Move to Men in particular focuses on not just money in politics, but actually abolishing the Supreme Court created doctrine of corporate constitutional rights. And why do we seek to do that? Basically because based on Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, corporations are considered persons with the same constitutional rights as human beings under the First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and 14th Amendments. So this problem goes much deeper than just the Citizens United decision's expansion of corporate, basically making clear or establishing that corporations and unions are entitled to First Amendment free speech rights, and that their political spending is a form of protected political speech. While this happened to open the floodgates and where we're actually seeing now our electoral cycles during each general election is basically ending up costing us more than tens of billions of dollars at times. Really, we've had this problem of excessive money in politics long before 2010. We've had, go back real quick. We've had a low representation in government long before then. Does anybody off the top of your head know who actually represents the vast majority of people in the country? So 31% of the represented U.S. population controls roughly 65% of all elected offices. 71% of all elected officials in the U.S. are men, 90% of them are white, and over 65% of them are white men. In Congress alone, over 81% of all our members are white males, and the median income of each member of Congress is over $1 million. And more than half of them, of course, are millionaires. So we can see, there's always been a low representation of the vast majority of us where we don't have nearly as much money as the people that are representing us, and they're increasingly becoming disassociated and just have never really looked like the vast majority of the population. We also can see that there have been significant barriers to voting. Especially within recent years with laws like voter ID laws that have basically created insurmountable barriers, including as well as gerrymandering that have created barriers for our local populations to actually exercise our most basic right to voting and choosing who actually represents us and whose interests they actually serve. And then two, we've also seen that campaign spending has always been high, long before even Citizens United. Does anybody remember back in the 1998 general election? Guess how much money we actually spent back in the 1998 election. Can anybody guess off the top of their heads? Go ahead, show around a number. $1 million? Way more than that. It's actually about $1.6 billion was actually what the 1998 general election cost us. Guess how much the 2010 election cost us back in the day? Oh yeah, just about twice that amount, $3.6 billion. So you can see even just after the Citizens United decision and 10 years before Citizens United, our electoral process already cost billions of dollars, which is significantly more than even other more developing democracies around the world. And how much access do you think that that you as constituents have compared with the campaign donors of our elected officials? According to a Harvard study, outside campaign donors actually have 3 times as much access to our elected officials, whether they're in their district or outside of their district, than the actual constituents that live within their districts. So you can see that even long before Citizens United, we really haven't had a representative have our candidates represent us, and they've oftentimes gone for sale to the highest bidder. Go ahead, next. So how do corporate elites use corporate constitutional rights? Basically, they use their rights to do two things. They overturn locally enacted regulations and protections by basically asserting their inalienable constitutional rights, and basically challenge them and threaten with, local and state governments and even the federal government with lawsuits. Many times winning, and I'll go into the history of that a little bit. They of course use their free speech, which is considered their political spending, to actually influence legislators and voters, usually in the form of writing model legislation, for those of you who are familiar with groups like ALEC. They also buy much political ads as independent political advocacy, which is why you see our airways flooded, like a year and sometimes even 2 years well in advance of any general election. And not only that, too, just the threat of a expensive corporate lawsuit can oftentimes be enough to dissuade our local and state representatives from actually enacting legislation that protects human beings in our interest, even when that legislation has overwhelming popularity. It creates a chilling effect that basically thwarts our capacity to actually pass democratically enacted legislation and exercise our inalienable right to local sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Beyond just that, too, corporations have helped, exacerbate ongoing environmental disasters, both natural and man-made. Even far worse, as they continue to pollute our environment, poison our waterways and make our land unusable, a lot of these environmental disasters and crises, the worst effects of climate change are often felt by low-income communities of color, where corporate polluters oftentimes locate on the paths of least resistance, vulnerable and marginalized communities being the top priority. In fact, a recent study has found that race is actually the single biggest determining factor for where toxic hazardous waste facilities are actually located. How do they do this? Because a lot of these low-income communities don't have the same level of resources as a multinational billion-dollar corporation. They oftentimes lack the resources, both political and economic, to thwart and fight off these big corporate polluters, and they can use their rights to suppress the vote. Whereas they help fund laws that pass voter IDs, help gerrymander our electoral boundaries and our campaign districts to basically thwart our will as a people and prevent us from actually challenging them and their candidates in which they fund. Worse too, exponentially, the recovery. It takes these communities especially longer exponentially longer to recover than more affluent white communities. Think of places like in Standing Rock, North Dakota, where the Dakota Access Pipeline was originally slated to pass through the community of Bismarck. Community was over a 90% white population. Their city council actually voted against the pipeline going through their pipe because of a natural concern. They were worried that it was going to poison their water supply, which more than 10 million people have access to. So rather than passing it through Bismarck, they decided to reroute the pipeline through indigenous protected land and still threaten the water supply of tens of millions of people. And because of the lack of resources, both political and economic, and this focus on protecting more affluent white communities, there's often been unequal treatment and a lack of funding support when these natural disasters happen. Some key examples, mind you. There we go. Recent examples like in Detroit, Michigan, and Flint, where in Detroit, nearly 300,000 people were basically shut off from their water access simply because of unpaid utility bills from predominantly low-income residents of color. Even as corporate businesses that were operating within the city and oftentimes forcing these low-income communities of color to relocate from their historical homes had unpaid utility bills that were oftentimes going over into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, as much as $500,000 in unpaid water bills. Those corporations were given great leniency, even as the residents of Detroit were having their water access shut off, which, for those of you who remember, the United Nations actually ruled to be a crime against humanity because water, as many of us already recognize, is a fundamental human right, our access to water. But worse than that, too, places like Flint, Michigan, where an unelectable emergency financial manager basically saw fit to save cost on providing clean water by relocating their water source from the Detroit River, or the river that was flowing from Detroit, and relocated it to the Flint River, which, as many of us have found out, was overwhelmingly contaminated with lead and other toxic waste from the auto manufacturing industry, and basically ended up poisoning tens of thousands of residents and making their water literally undrinkable. Even to this day, this very moment, there are tens of thousands of Flint residents who still are without safe, clean water to drink, and the state of Michigan, the government of Michigan, is actually considering cutting off that water supply as we speak. The next slide. Same thing, too, with the Standing Rock, North Dakota, where tens of thousands of indigenous tribes came together to oppose this pipeline, which was relocated from running through Bismarck and basically onto indigenous land, in clear violation of treaties of the Fort Laramie Treaty set back in 1851, and continuing a long, ongoing history of the U.S. breaking its promise to the indigenous people from which their land was originally stolen from. Even recent natural disasters, like last year's Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston, Texas, many of the communities, the lowland communities of Houston ended up getting flooded, and this just so happened to be predominantly communities of color that were located along toxic waste facilities, such as these chemical plants, which ended up getting flooded and leaving many low-income residents to basically wade and sit in toxic, contaminated water for days and sometimes even weeks on end before they actually got help and the waters actually receded. And it created uncontrollable fires as well that took emergency responders days to actually get to, and the corporate operators of these plants basically had to evacuate their employees and just say, this plant is more than likely going to explode, and there's nothing we can do about it. Why do corporations do this, and how do they get away with this? Shouldn't they be serving a public benefit? Well, unfortunately, thanks to the Supreme Court, corporations' primary purpose is set by court decree that their primary purpose is to maximize the wealth and profit of their shareholders. A really infamous case back in 1919, Dodge versus Ford. So basically, corporations are able to externalize their costs away from themselves and onto the most marginalized and vulnerable communities among us. And they create greater disparities in pollution exposure, environmental damage, and worsen inequality across the board, basically. There's a key difference, of course, with what corporations, how corporations are versus, we as human beings. And of course, corporations don't get sick, they don't go to jail, they don't have children, And they, of course, don't breathe, eat, or drink. They don't play, they don't pray, they don't die. They're basically immortal beings, and yet, despite these key differences, unlike human beings, they actively oppose any kind of legislation that would give us affordable health care, expand social services to protect the most vulnerable among us, create affordable education, and are in fact actively working to privatize education and retain the focus to create obedient and skillful workers rather than critically thinking, fully developed human personalities. And they openly thwart our environmental rules and protections and other social goods, unless, of course, there is any kind of money that they can make off of this. How did this happen? How did we get to the point where our government basically prioritizes corporate wealthy property interests over the basic rights and well-being of human beings? Well, the fact of the matter is they possess enormous amounts of resources that allow them to influence our electoral process, to draft model legislation, as I mentioned, and of course to pay high funding operating lobbyists who basically influence and directly support our elected officials over we the people's interests. Also, too, the courts have enabled this behavior and enabled them to have this much power. Unelectable judges, particularly from the Supreme Court, have basically saw fit to extend and open up the Constitution to include corporations, despite the fact that there's never once been any mention of corporations in the original text of the Constitution. So what happens to our right to self-government? How can we, as free-thinking human beings, exercise our inalienable right to local sovereignty? The answer is that we can't, really. But here's the democracy that we were initially promised by the founders of the United States. And you can say it with me. I'll say it first, and then you can say it with me. Or actually read along with me right now. We the people are free and sovereign because we hold all the political power, but we delegate some of our power to government, that is subordinate and accountable. We assign government duties, which they discharge by writing laws in the public interest, but no law can violate the private rights of individual citizens. That's a great concept. That's what we were promised in the beginning when we created this country, this democracy of, by, and for the people. Who here actually believes that we practice that in any way, shape, or form? Quite right. This is the reality in which we live. For those of you who are familiar with the original draft of the Constitution, you'll notice that the Constitution the original Constitution did not include any mention of human rights. It was written as a property rights document that expressed the powers, the commercial interests and the powers of Congress to regulate commerce, while adding human rights as a basic afterthought. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. But even after the Bill of Rights was ratified in the Constitution, the fact that it ultimately failed to mention who was a person worthy of constitutional protection. So that basically only applied, those constitutional protections that were added in the Bill of Rights were only applied to white male property owners, the very wealthiest among us, while excluding women, black, brown, and indigenous people of color, and even impoverished non-landowning white men, the vast majority of U.S. citizens. At the time, white male property owners were only less than 10% of the population. So more than 90% were literally excluded from basic constitutional protections. And of course, there was absolutely no mention of corporations in the text. The framers of the Constitution had no confusion or disagreement about what the nature of corporations, which is why during the original constitutional conventions, there was really no debate. In fact, the only mention of corporations was in how is whether Congress should have the power to have the power of incorporation to create corporations, which they ultimately voted down and said this should be corporations should only be created under state law. And this is how states actually created corporations. Prior to the 1880s, corporations were actually very limited in their scope. When you became incorporated, you were basically extended certain privileges, which were called legal rights. You were given legal personhood in order to operate as a single entity. And this allowed you to, this basically gave corporations the ability to enter into contracts, to own property, and to sue and be sued as as a single entity. When their corporate charters were created, they actually had to be have a defined purpose. Basically, it had to serve some kind of benefit to the public, and whatever purpose that was defined in their corporate charter, they could not deviate from that purpose without having to go through the process of having state legislatures pass it into law and then have it be signed off by the governor. This created a big hurdles because the power of a corporation was very great, and it was a privilege, not a right, to actually incorporate and operate in this express public benefit. Furthermore, those corporate charters that were created by state law were limited in their duration, typically about 25 to 50 years or less. And corporate charters were approved and revocable by state legislatures, meaning that if they broke the law or harmed our communities, they were subject to being dissolved by the state, which is basically the equivalent of the death penalty, and their assets would be dissolved and distributed amongst the employers or the employees, which comprise their membership. Furthermore, they were expressly prohibited from participating in the political process, even at points of the state constitutions, such as the Pennsylvania Constitution 1857, which stated that the legislature shall have the power to alter, revoke, or annul any charter of incorporation hereafter conferred by or under special or general law, whenever, in their opinion, it may be injurious to the citizens of the Commonwealth. This was a key feature to make sure that no matter how big corporations grew, they still maintained control. They were still controllable and able to be regulated by we the people. Fast forward to today, where corporations are basically free-reigning entities. They're now considered equal persons with the same inalienable rights as you and me. Their corporate charters do not need to have a purpose that is defined, and there is no limit or limited if appropriate. So basically, corporations like Amazon, like Walmart, like Google, they can operate in so many different industries, do so many different things without any expectation or limitation of what they can and cannot do. And that makes it very hard for local businesses, smaller businesses, to actually compete. And it also, of course, allows them to help work to prevent our laws, such as regulations of CO2 emissions, in fact, actively thwarting the scientific observation of how greenhouse gases are destroying our climate and exacerbating, creating this man-made climate change. It allows them to draft legislation, and of course, avoid and challenge regulations such as our regulatory inspections, and basically requires that we treat even the most massive multinational corporations as equal to that of local businesses with vastly smaller resources. They're also indefinite in duration, which allows corporations like Standard Oil to basically exist forever and eventually change their name to the modern-day corporation Chevron, or JP Morgan Bank to eventually merge with JP Morgan Chase and become one of the top 10 financial institutions owning more than half of the wealth of the United States. And these corporate charters no longer go through the state legislative process. Rather than being approved as law, they basically only have to pay a small fee, about $250 to a law clerk at a state office, and they are basically incorporated as a corporation. Anybody can do this if you have the money, but corporations especially can do that, and those corporate charters literally last forever. And of course, there is no limit on their political participation these days, thanks to decisions like Citizens United. Prior to the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, when it was ratified, was expressly intended to protect the rights of African Americans following the abolition of slavery. basically the main purpose, according to Associate Justice Samuel Freeman Miller at the time, was that the last three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, was expressly for the freedom of the African race, security and perpetuation of that freedom, and their protection from the oppression of white men who had formerly held them in slavery. Furthermore, a further case also ruled that the 14th Amendment cannot be used to protect corporations from state law. That was the nature of the 14th Amendment before 1886. Then comes Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which, for those of you who know, that was what opened the door for corporations to eventually gain a foothold into the constitutional framework so that they can claim inalienable rights the same as human beings. So, from this decision, the Chief Justice, basically this decision wasn't even actually precedent. It wasn't supposed to be. This was actually the opening statement of Chief Justice Morrison Waite at the time, who opened oral arguments for the lawyers arguing the case, that the court does not wish to hear the argument on the question of whether the 14th Amendment to the Constitution forbids a state to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of its laws, or of the laws applies to corporations. We're all of the opinion that it does. So this was basically guidance for the lawyers who were arguing the actual case, which didn't have anything to do with providing equal protection for corporations, from avoiding trying to make those arguments. But thanks to the court recorder at the time, a man by the name of Bancroft Davis, who just so happened to own his own railroad company operating out of the state of New York, he added that to the official opinion as a head note in that doctrine. And then from that decision, it basically opened the door for the Supreme Court just 2 years later to claim in 1889's Minneapolis and St. Louis Railways versus Beckwith that corporations, or the 14th Amendment's equal protection and due process clause apply to corporations. And from this decision, it cemented an error by a rogue law clerk into the official court opinion. And from that decision, it basically allowed corporations to claim other inalienable human rights under the Constitution, which includes the Fifth Amendment's, or actually the Fourth Amendment, which was actually ruled back in 1906, Hale versus Henkel. Back in 1906, the case Hale versus Henkel basically found that under the Fourth Amendment's unreasonable search and seizure protections, a corporation's books are effectively protected, or basically protected under the Fourth Amendment, meaning that if a regulatory agency wants to open their books and make sure that there are no violations according to our regulatory law, it requires a warrant, and the government is required to provide advance notice to that corporation before it can open their books, essentially giving them warning that their violations are subject to being inspected, and giving them enough leeway to hide any violations which might be found within their books and processes. And the Fourth Amendment has allowed them to avoid subpoenas for unlawful trade and price fixing, and to prevent citizens and communities and regulatory agencies from stopping corporate pollution and health and labor violations and other assaults on the people and the commons. Furthermore, it allowed them in 1922, Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahon, to basically extend Fifth Amendment protections to takings. In this case, the Pennsylvania Coal Company was effectively drilling and mining for coal under residential properties, creating massive sinkholes that destroyed entire homes and communities and contaminated local water supply. When the state of Pennsylvania passed a state regulation, one of the first environmental protections that outlawed this practice, Pennsylvania Coal Company sued all the way to the Supreme Court. And in effect, the Supreme Court sided on behalf of Pennsylvania Coal Company, saying that a strong public desire to improve the public condition is not enough to warrant achieving the desire by a shorter cut than the constitutional way of paying for the charge. The court effectively ruled that under the Fifth Amendment's takings clause, environmental regulations, or any regulation of that matter, for that matter, are basically a form of takings by the government, and the government is required to provide just compensation for lost property to that corporation, which in this case included the lost profits from being able to mine under people's residential properties. And from that decision, it basically made it clear that no regulation, whether that's over the environment, or that's over labor, or even health and food and human safety, are basically open to a corporate lawsuit under the Fifth Amendment. And it led to a famous, there's the Fourth Amendment slide, which you can see Justin Harlan's opinion, but if you can go back to the other one really quick. You see also, too, Justice Brandeis making, in a famous dissent, saying that the restriction imposed to protect the public health, safety, or morals from dangers threatened is not a taking. The property so restricted remains in the possession of its owner, and the state merely prevents the owner from making a use which interferes with paramount rights of the public. Basically, our right to protect ourselves from corporate harms is basically cannot overcome a corporate lawsuit or challenge under the Fifth Amendment. Continue on. Next one. So, on to the First Amendment before 2010. Under the First Amendment before then, the court opened up basically preceded the Citizens United decision with really another infamous case called Buckley versus Vallejo back in 1976. And essentially the court basically recognized that political spending is considered a form of protected political speech, so that campaign spending by corporations were subject to limitations could not be limited by the government under the First Amendment because it was considered a form of protected political speech. And from this decision, it opened the door for future court cases like First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti in 1978 that basically found that corporate spending for the purpose of influencing or affecting court opinions or affecting opinions of voters is protected speech under the First Amendment. But it didn't actually extend First Amendment free speech protections explicitly to corporations. It basically just said that political spending, limits on political spending were subject to their own limitations under the First Amendment. But the court opened the door for corporations to claim First Amendment free speech protections back in 1991, International Dairy Foods Association versus Amistoy, where the International Dairy Foods Association basically were regulated to require them to publicly disclose whether or not their milk products contained bovine growth hormone, which at the time was considered harmful for humans. International Dairy Foods sued the Supreme Court, and in that decision, the court basically found that corporations have negative free speech rights. Essentially, a corporation has a right not to speak to the contents of its products. Fast forward to the First Amendment after 2010. Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission was the first Supreme Court decision that effectively found that free speech was the right to free speech should be extended to corporations and unions under the law. Basically found that the government cannot suppress political speech based on corporate identity. Corporations are people. And from this decision, it opened the door to see the floodgates open and unlimited amounts of money spent as independent political advocacy to flood our airways and support the candidates that were most friendly to corporate interests. It also opened the door for future decisions, continued rollbacks of campaign finance law in McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, where it found that the aggregate limits on individual donations to political campaigns had no sufficient governmental interest justified to those limits, and basically found that the governmental interest in regulating campaign finance is limited explicitly to quid pro quo corruption, essentially meaning that unless a corporation is expressly, clearly giving money for an express benefit, the appearance of corruption is not actually justifiable means for the government to regulate that political spending. In that same year, the court also extended the First Amendment even further by giving Hobby Lobby, a closely owned for-profit corporation, an exemption from the Affordable Care Act, basically saying that closely owned for-profit corporations are exempt from laws its owners religiously object to. So under the Affordable Care Act, Hobby Lobby was exempt from providing its female employees access to comprehensive coverage through its employer-based health insurance because it conflicted with its owners' religious beliefs. So basically, the rights of women and your freedom to choose and make health decisions on your own behalf are basically subject to corporate veto, which is absolutely crazy. What are the results of these Supreme Court decisions? Essentially, corporate interests in property and commerce and wealth supersede any cause or interest in protecting the general welfare for human beings or our human rights. In fact, because while the Supreme Court was actually seeking to extend these inalienable constitutional rights to corporations, they were also limiting them for the vast majority of human beings. Is anybody familiar with the case Minor versus Happersett of 1878? So in that year, the Supreme Court basically found that the 14th Amendment, originally intended to protect African Americans, couldn't be extended to women because the federal government does not have standing to force the states to provide or to recognize equal protection for women under state law. So it basically used the 14th Amendment as a federal law to prevent states from treating women as equal persons under the 14th Amendment as well. In fact, after the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad decision, in the 300 cases following that decision involving the 14th Amendment, over 288 of those decisions were applied to corporations versus only 17 for African Americans. In fact, we all know that in 1899, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court actually used the 14th Amendment to recognize that African Americans were not entitled to having equal facilities, basically creating the separate but equal doctrine and forcing black Americans to use inferior facilities compared to white Americans for more than 60 years after that decision, and allowing for the Jim Crow laws that were happening all across the South to be extended and further perpetuated, well, even into today. In fact, going further than that, the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment to actually overturn more than 200 democratically enacted regulations over the course of 30 years following the infamous case in 1905, Lochner versus New York, creating the process of substantive due process and basically made it even harder for our communities, including our state governments, to regulate corporate activities. And that continues well into this day. So we're seeing the pattern here, right? That large corporations can afford to assert their rights better than human beings, as long as corporations are considered equal persons with inalienable rights, and their money, their political spending, is a form of protected political speech, they can afford to assert those rights better than any real human being or our communities. And it continues on too. I mean, even when it comes to small businesses, the wealth and power is used to slow or halt enforcement that would balance the playing field for those businesses. Famous court case, Lewis K. Leggett versus Lee back in 1933, effectively overturned a progressive tax in Florida that would have taxed bigger multinational chain corporations versus smaller mom and pop shops, basically overturned that progressive tax, saying that the large corporation with more resources needs to be treated the same as a smaller business with far less resources, effectively making it impossible for small businesses to actually compete. So their wealth and power is used to slow or halt enforcement that guarantees equal protection and equity within our legal system and our political process, and any law that we enact can be challenged in court, essentially meaning that our laws cannot be applied equally without the threat of a corporate challenge. So what can we, the people, actually do? Well, the first thing that we can do is have these conversations here within among our communities about the impacts of corporate rule within our daily lives. Spread the word about corporate constitutional rights, because as 80%, or as polls have shown, over 80% of the public across the political spectrum, whether they're Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green, or Independent, agree with us that corporations should not have the same rights as human beings and that money should be regulated in our political process, but many people don't know that there is an active grassroots movement working to amend the Constitution to make clear corporations are not people and money is not speech. So we need to spread the word and let people know about Move to Amend and let them know that there is this grassroots campaign for a 28th Amendment. Abolishing corporate constitutional rights begins with supporting the We the People Amendment, introduced in Congress as House Joint Resolution 48. And, of course, we encourage you to join Move to Amend and other grassroots organizations working in solidarity with those of us on the front lines of corporate rule, of struggle against corporate rule, to join us in this work in passing this amendment. So one of the basic things that we encourage everyone to do is to pull out, is to sign the motion to amend, which is our national petition of more than 450,000 people have signed supporting an amendment that addresses both court-created doctrines of corporate constitutional rights and money is speech. So right now, pull out your phones. If you haven't already signed the petition, pull out your phones and text AMEND to 707-656-4019 and and join over 450,000 other people in support of this movement. And of course, if you don't want to do that, or you're wary about texting your number somewhere, you can always sign the petition online at movetoamend.org/motion. And the most basic thing that you can do right now is just ask your friends and family, join you in signing the motion to amend, and add their names to the petition. Because it's going to take millions of people really to be powerful enough to force Congress and the states to really take action on this. And we've seen a lot of progress here in the last few years in the past 8 years since this movement first began. We encourage you really to volunteer and join our local affiliate network, which is our grassroots, which is the backbone of our national nonpartisan coalition. Starting a local affiliate group right here in Rochester can be a basic first step and really getting involved with the grassroots movement. And there are folks right now involved who would like to see an affiliate get started here, and you can read more about the benefits and requirements of becoming a Move to Amend affiliate over on our website, movetoamend.org/affiliate. And really, our local volunteers have been what's allowed us to be as successful as we have and get as far as we have with the We the People Amendment. Over the past 8 years, more than 750 local resolutions have been passed in liberal and conservative communities alike. In places such as Waukesha, Wisconsin, the hometown of Governor Scott Walker, in the same year that re-elected him during his recall election, also approved one of our resolutions by more than 70%. And this includes resolutions like that were passed more than 300 times by ballot initiative, usually in landslides of over 70 and even 80%. And that includes even at the state level, where 19 states, our volunteers have helped pass resolutions through their state legislatures, including conservative states like Montana, which back in 2012 approved one of our state resolutions by a margin of over 75 to 25%. So we really have one of the few issues that really transcends the political partisan divide, and that's why we've actually been endorsed by more than 500 organizations at the local, state, and federal level, from nonprofits and labor councils to political parties and business alliances. This includes political parties such as the Pottawatomie County Republican Party of Iowa, which back in 2016 not only passed a resolution, or not only endorsed Move to Amend, but actually changed its 2016 platform to include a call for the abolition of corporate constitutional rights. We not to mention, of course, we've been endorsed too by dozens of Democratic parties, including even the largest Democratic party out in California, which just last year actually approved unanimously a resolution calling for its members to support the Move to Amend campaign and support an amendment to the Constitution to address both corporate constitutional rights and money as speech, unanimously at their state party convention. So this, or I'm sorry, go back to the screen one more time. So this is all thanks to the involvement of our affiliate networks, such as state networks like the Minnesota Move to Amend network and the Rochester Move to Amend, both before and now, working to get your representatives like Tim Waltz to co-sponsor the We the People amendment. But this isn't the only way to get involved with our national coalition. There are other alternatives if you don't have the capacity or don't necessarily agree with the requirements of becoming a full-fledged Move to Amend affiliate. You can always form your own working group with whatever organization that you're involved with, or just a small group of your friends. And you can support the We the People Amendment as an ad hoc group with some support from the national coalition, such as sending out email blasts or putting up any local events and directing interested volunteers to your group. You can form these amendment working groups and learn more at movetoamend.org/amendment-working-groups. And of course, the most basic thing beyond just joining a group, you can always help us gather petition signatures. You can collect your petition signatures by, you can learn how to collect petition signatures at movetoamend.org/petition, and you can print them off right now. In fact, we can hand you out. We have copies of petitions that you can just take home a sheet, get 6 signatures from your friends and neighbors, and then send them directly to Move to Amend's national headquarters or to Minnesota Move to Amend, and we'll enter those in, and you're helping to grow the movement going forward. You also have, if you're really interested in volunteering, volunteer sheets at each of your seats where you can, if you fill out your name and then hand them over to me and Barbara, we'll collect those and we'll actually follow up with you within 2 weeks and talk with you about how you can get involved within the Move to Amend affiliate network and the national coalition. And the bare minimum too, if you're involved with with an organization here locally in Rochester or in the state of Minnesota, you can always join the over 500 organizations, local, state, and national, who have endorsed Move to Amend. You can either follow the democratic process of your own institution and pass a resolution in support of the We the People Amendment, which you can find on our website. Or you can just add your name to our list of 500 organizations at movetoamend.org/organizations, whichever you prefer. We prefer you to do it through a consensus decision-making, of course. And if you're looking to learn more if you have a number one issue that you're really most passionate about that doesn't include amending the Constitution, I usually say that if you have a number one issue, whether that's universal health care, whether that's environmental justice, or ending the school-to-prison pipeline, or ending police brutality, make Move to Amend your number 2 issue. Because if we can actually limit this court-created doctrine of corporate constitutional rights and end corporate rule, we can actually level the playing field so that all of our movements across the spectrum can actually have a level playing field and open the door to a broader discussion for what kind of democracy that we actually want in this country. And we have several issue sector caucuses that relate to these issues. We have an interfaith caucus for those of you who are interested in reaching out to your fellow members of your faith-based or ethical values communities and really, challenge the nature of corporate rule and how it directly infringes and violates your most deeply held personal and spiritual beliefs. You can also, if you're a member of organized labor, join our labor caucus, which is working to get getting central labor councils and local labor union halls to endorse the We the People, or to endorse the We the People amendment and join our national coalition. And of course, if you have a creative spark and want to help us spread the word about corporate rule and using creative outlets and inventive direct action, join our Arts and Culture Caucus, which meets on the first Tuesdays of every month. And of course, if you're also involved as an educator or have been a teacher and are really concerned with how corporations are directly impacting the school curriculum and looking to privatize that and limit access to basic quality education, join our Educators Caucus and help us expand the curriculum so that we're actually studying the authentic history of the United States and not just the one that's produced by wealthy corporate interests looking to create obedient, skillful workers. And one of the most easiest things you can do is just call your House reps and your senators. Ask them to join more than 66 other colleagues in supporting House Joint Resolution 48, which is currently going to be reintroduced in the next session with each co-sponsor. What we have to do in order to pass the We the People Amendment is get 290 representatives in the House, in the Congressional House, and 67 senators to vote on this, to vote yes on this amendment. So we have a strategic plan in place that is intended to basically that lays out the key benchmarks that we need to meet each year in order to be successful in ratifying the amendment within the next 7 years. So passing it by 2025 and hopefully ratifying it within the next 2 years. Ask your senators, Senator Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar, calling them and asking them to introduce a companion bill in the U.S. Senate for the first time. And of course, asking your candidates and incumbents running for office right here, right now, where they stand on the issue of corporate constitutional rights and a 28th Amendment. You can ask them to sign the pledge to amend at movetoamend.org/pledge, and you can commit yourself and encourage your friends and neighbors to take the voter pledge and commit yourselves to voting only for the candidates that will expressly support this movement and support a 28th Amendment to the Constitution. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions and answers, and happily talk through any concerns or questions you have about Move to Amend.
I just want to make a comment that looking at the co-sponsors, two current co-sponsors, one is running for Attorney General in Minnesota and the other is running for Governor in Minnesota.
Yeah, definitely.
The AG candidate was one of the
Original co-sponsors for ours.
And a sponsor or a co-chair who helped to found the antitrust coalition in the House. So.
Yeah, that's true. They're going to be moving on to other parts, to other levels of government, and it's just as important to get people who are willing to take or to challenge corporate rule in places like the Attorney General's office, but that's not going to preclude that we can't get their successor to co-sponsor the amendment. In fact, our lead sponsor, as you know, Rick Nolan, is going to be retiring at the end of this year, and we already have a lead sponsor in place to reintroduce the We the People Amendment with each new cycle. So trust me when I say we're in good hands, and of course we shouldn't let the successors off the hook, and we should remind them too that their predecessors support this, and that will add extra pressure for them to follow in their footsteps and join this coalition.
So there are a couple of confusing things going on at the same time. There's another group that I'm sure you're aware of that is trying to do a constitutional convention for a balanced budget amendment and some other probably right-wing stuff.
Right. The conventions of, or the Assembly of States, I think is what it's called.
Yeah. So they're trying to put that through state legislatures at the same time. So could you just, to be very clear, I mean, what you're doing here, what you're proposing, is the more the way that we usually think of getting an amendment passed, by having Congress pass it and then the states ratify, right?
Yes.
What they're trying to do is do an end run around Congress and go through the states, which apparently they're quite close to succeeding at, and would, from my understanding, would present a really dangerous thing, because you could have the so-called runaway convention, but what you're proposing is completely different than that, right?
So we get that concern raised a lot about the possibility of a runaway convention, and we are closely monitoring this assembly of state lawmakers that are pushing for this end run around Congress. To be clear, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Article 5 amendment process, there are two routes in which you can propose and vote on an amendment. Either 2/3 of Congress, 290 House representatives, or 67 senators can propose and vote on an amendment, or 2/3 of states, or 34 states, can petition Congress for an amendment proposing convention under Article 5, and the states can propose an amendment. But either route that you take, whether that's through the states or through Congress, you still have to ratify it within 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 38 states. At the time, from my last check, the Convention of the States on the Balance of Budget Amendment currently only has 32 state not 32 state legislatures. Actually, it's, I believe, 26 state legislatures that have passed a formal petition calling specifically for this amendment, or for that amendment. But we have to be clear, these are mostly predominantly Republican states that no matter what route they go, they have to get blue and purple states in order to succeed in getting this balanced budget amendment or an Article 5 convention into action, basically. So they can't just do it alone, and given the current political activism that's going on right now and the potential coming up for this, they actually stand to lose momentum on that. And it's also to be clear a little bit about the history of amendment of the Article 5 convention process. Over the course of our 231-year history with the Constitution, there have been more than 400 petitions for an amendment proposing convention from the states on a variety of laws beyond, or a variety of amendments beyond just the balanced budget amendment. But none of these only a handful of these, by my count 5, have actually come close to calling for an Article 5 convention. But here's the thing with this. To just explain Move to Men's position, we're focused on going through the congressional route because that's how all 27 amendments to the Constitution have been passed, which makes it the most successful route. And that's what we're focused on going through right now. However, we don't want to take off the possibility of taking the route through the state legislatures as well, through the Article 5 process. Because with those over 400 attempts of going around Congress, any time that the states have come close, which has come close about 3 or 5 times, whenever the states seem close to calling for an amendment proposing convention, Congress itself takes action. Most notably with the 17th Amendment's direct election of senators. And furthermore, it also can be considered one of the most democratic means of amending the Constitution because it actually requires a deliberative process for creating the amendment outside of the 535 members in Congress and actually takes it directly to the people themselves. In fact, the Article 5 process also allows for state ratifying conventions, which are direct votes by the people to ratify an amendment. And it's been used, in the 27 times that we've amended the Constitution, it's been used only once, most notable, or the 21st Amendment's repeal of prohibition. But right now we consider it too early of a stage to really wed ourselves to any one process. We're going to continue focusing on the congressional route because that's the most successful path, but we also don't want to take it off the table because, as we can see through history, Congress hates ceding power to anyone, much less the states. So if we are we don't want to take any tool off the table that can stand us to force Congress to take action. So if Congress isn't going to take action on the amendment themselves, we can force them to take action through our state legislatures ourselves. And like I said, it still requires 38 states in order to ratify. So even if Republicans beat us with a balanced budget amendment, they still have to go through 38 states, which includes many states state governments that disagree with them on a balanced budget amendment. Any other questions? Okay. With that said, if you have any additional questions or you want more information about how to get involved with Move to Amend or how you can support the movement individually, you can always contact Minnesota Move to Amend. Our very talented state coordinator, Barbara Gerten, would be happy, is easily reachable at the phone number on the screen, as well as you can email minnesota@movetoamend.org and learn how to get involved. Yeah.
Actually, maybe Barbara can say, and maybe Julie can say about, what's actually happening with it, what kind of work you're doing actually here.
Sure.
In Minnesota and in Rochester.
Absolutely. Come on up.
Thank you. Yes, so we have been busy working on Pledge to Amend. So it's election season, and we are asking all of those who are running for our state house races to let us know where they stand. And so you will find it on that website. There is a list of those who have signed the pledge. It's not too late. You can contact all the candidates in races where you notice they have not responded and ask them to fill out the questionnaire on our pledge site. We're also planning another meeting here in Rochester, and I have some information, save the date. I'm going to hand those out because I want you to write some information on it. Yeah, great. So in a month, so after the election, people wonder what they can do. So we're going to get together on November 17th, and at that time, we can contact each of the newly elected House representatives and ask them to become co-sponsors on the bill that will be introduced in this upcoming session. It's not too late to start contacting them and letting them know that constituents are really concerned about this and that they should get behind that bill. So this is what you can write down. In the past session, I'm going to give you the numbers of the bill so that you can do some research if you'd like. So in our House, the bill was House File 2139, and that was introduced by Representative Raymond Dean, D-E-H-N. And in the Senate, our lead on that is Senator John Marty, and that bill is Senate File, or SF 1082. And this past session, we managed to get more senators than we had in other sessions, and we had a cloned bill, and that is Senate File 3342. So it's the first time we were able to do that. We worked really hard to get our co-sponsors for those bills, even though we knew it wouldn't pass. But it helps going forward to know who's committed, who we can count on, and to say, you co-sponsored it last session, get on board again, and then to keep working and adding to that number. And then you will have a new congressional representative, and so that person we need to work on to get behind House Joint Resolution 48. We don't know if it'll be that number, right?
Right now, we're going to aim to keep that number as best we can. It's what we did with the most recent cycle, when it was reintroduced in January 2017. But it may be a different number. We'll let you know exactly what that number is if it is changed. But we're going to try and keep that as long as we can.
So Representative Nolan sort of had that number reserved, so he was standing in line waiting when 48 come up, that it would be 48 again. So he did that 3 years in a row. So maybe we can pull it off. It'll be House Joint Resolution 48 again. So that's the congressional district. And we're doing lots of other things, but we can talk about that if we want, but
Yeah, does anybody have any questions for Barbara? All right. And also open it forward to Julie as well. If anybody has any questions for Julie, she's taking the lead in your questions to you.
I cede to Barbara.
Thank you, Julie.
No, those of you that are interested, please come to the follow-up meeting in November.
Mm-hmm.
We'd like to keep this going, and we'd like to get our new representatives off to a good start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you're interested in volunteering, sign those forms as well, and we'll make sure that they get to Julie, so she and Barbara can follow up with you after this night.
And I do want to thank some people who really made this happen. Anne, down here in the front, Julie, Frank, in the back, or Marie, sorry. Anne and Bill, back here, who is recording. Who did I miss? Oh, is Paulette here?
No.
She was helping with some promotion pieces. So thank you, much appreciated. And thank you all for coming. Wonderful seeing you all here.